Good evening, and welcome to this most extraordinary remote version of the 16th annual Morton Deutsch Awards for Distinguished Contributions to Social Justice. We are very happy to be with you virtually this evening. My name is Peter Coleman. I'm the director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Teachers College, Columbia, and we host these awards annually. And I'll give you a little context for this. About 50 years ago, Morton Deutsch began to agitate the world of social justice research. He likes to tell the story that when he was 5 years old, he was denied participation in a softball game with a bunch of older boys, and he, for reparations, stole the ball and threw it in the woods. And then later, as an adolescent, he was working as a busboy in the Catskills at a resort, and he organized a boycott for better conditions for the busboys. So he likes to say that that was the beginnings of his concerns around social injustice and justice in academia. It was a series of articles that he published. First, an article called Awakening a Sense of Injustice, which is one of my favorite articles of his, published in 1974, and then in 1975 he published an article called Equity, Equality, and Need. And those culminated in a book on distributive justice that he published in 1985, which really started to cause trouble, because in these articles in this book, Mort really took on the main theoretical framework of the time on social justice, which was something called distributive justice theory. Equity theory by Adams. And what he did was basically deconstruct it and expose that the theory had kind of underlying Western capitalist assumptions that weren't appropriate in many settings of our world. So in doing so, he really disoriented and infuriated and agitated, but ultimately reinvigorated the area of academic scholarship on social justice. And not to rest on his laurels, Mort continued really through his career to work on issues of social justice and agitate for decades on this. In 2002, he gathered us together and started an academic group on trying to understand systems of oppression and injustice. How do they come about, and how are they so difficult to change? He was particularly concerned and interested with the increasing gap between the haves and have-nots in the US and around the world. And so we convened and read widely for a period of time and had discussion about it. And the group came to the understanding that social science had done a fantastic job at understanding and capturing how these systems of injustice become so difficult to change. But they led to very few breakthroughs as to what we could do to interrupt social injustice and to affect systems of oppression in any real practical ways. So a small group of us started by launching a conference together on sustaining justice and interrupting oppression. And it was a group of scholars and activists, students and philanthropists who were concerned about this. And for this, Mort offered a conceptual framework that was eventually published in a journal of social justice research. And the meeting was a 3-day meeting, which led to a lot of value in the field, and certainly intellectual and empirical value in the field of social justice. But possibly most importantly, it led to this award. We decided that we needed to somehow incentivize and celebrate both critical intellectual contributions through research on social justice, as well as groundbreaking, innovative programs on the ground that really made a difference in people's lives. So we launched this annual award for distinguished contributions in both research and practice. And our previous attendees, there's a list I'll show you here, are exceptional people: Michelle Fine, Jeff Canada, Marjorie Banaji, John Jost, two Polish colleagues that were very instrumental to the nonviolent transition of power there in the early 90s, Janusz Rakowski and Janusz Zielak, Sister Elaine Roulet, who founded multiple programs around incarcerated parents and connecting them with their children. Claude Steele, an extraordinary social psychologist. Erwin Staub, Gene Sharp, a tremendous scholar in nonviolence. Gretchen Buchenholz, Abby Disney, the Fortune Society, Mike Wessels, Daryl Wing Su, Teachers College, eminent scholar in microaggressions, James M. Jones, and then last year, Miriam Kaba, who is also just an extraordinary social activist in her own right. In addition to this, we usually every year honor student papers, the best student papers on issues of social justice. Here's a list of those students, and we have to date honored about 20 different students, sometimes jointly on a paper, who have done exceptional work on interrupting oppression and sustaining social justice. So I'd like to begin by just first thanking the organizers and volunteers for this. First, I want to in particular thank Danielle Kuhn, who really was at the point of this for the center, but worked with Keenan Powers and Charlotte Masick, who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. And then Rosella Garcia and Hwa Chu Yen, and their team from Alumni Relations, who helped us sort of organize and put all this together and made this recording. This evening will be, the presentation this evening will be in sort of three sections. First, Danielle Kuhn, who's the Associate Director of the MD ICCCR, will make introductions. We'll introduce our recipient, our distinguished scholar practitioner recipient for this evening, who is Dr. Rob Gore. Dr. Gore is an extraordinary emergency room physician who has founded a program called CAVI, which you'll hear more about, which is the Kings Against Violence Initiative. It is a program for young people who are at risk for violence that offers a variety of different services to celebrate who they are and allow them to hopefully thrive even under difficult conditions. So he's done incredible work, and I'm excited that you'll hear about it. And so Rob will make some remarks after Danielle's introduction, and then we'll move to a conversation between Rob and Dr. Chris Emden, who is a faculty member at Teachers College, who's done extraordinary work in his own right. And they will have a conversation, a sort of free-flowing conversation of Rob's work and its implications for young people today. So we're excited about this event. Thank you for joining us virtually. Hopefully we'll see you next year in person and enjoy or appreciate what comes now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, I am Danielle Kuhn, the Associate Director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Gore, the founder and Executive Director of the Kings Against Violence Initiative, also known as CAVI. Dr. Gore is an attending physician and clinical assistant professor at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. After finishing his undergraduate studies at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, he went on to SUNY Buffalo for medical school. He completed his emergency medicine residency training at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, where he was the chief resident. In 2009, Dr. Gore founded CAVI, a hospital and school-based youth violence intervention prevention and empowerment program targeting teens that have been injured as a result of violence or at risk for violence and a recurrent violent injury. He is also the founder and director of the Minority Medical Student Emergency Medicine Summer Fellowship, which is a mentoring and enrichment program for underrepresented minorities interested in emergency medicine with a focus on project development. Dr. Gore has lectured around the U.S., the Caribbean, and Asia, and has worked in East Africa, Haiti, and South America. Since 2008, he has been working as a consultant for Clinique Espérance et Vie in Terre Rouge and working towards establishing a regional healthcare system in the northern part of Haiti. He is on the board of directors for eMedics International, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the global promotion and advancement of emergency medicine, disaster management, and public health. Dr. Gore grew up in Brooklyn, the son of a community activist and a teacher. When he's not working, he's an avid wanderer, traveler, photographer, and snowboarder, and a student of capoeira. He and his wife are also the happy parents of a sweet baby boy born this past summer. I am very proud, humbled, and grateful to present the 2020 Morton Deutsch Award for Social Justice to my friend Dr. Rob Gore. Thank you for everything that you do.
Very excited to be the recipient of the award. This means a lot, especially with the work that we're doing with our organization, CAVI, the Kings Against Violence Initiative. Conflict itself is something that is very near and personal to me. But even greater than that is, really developing this understanding of how do we make sure that our people are at their best. From our experiences working in the emergency department, our experiences working in the community, my experiences growing up in the community in which I still serve, we do recognize that there's another way. I became a physician because I had this love of science, and I love being around people, and I love helping people. But a number of years ago, I wanted to take it up another notch, and had an idea of what it would be like to create an environment and a space where people don't have to become patients. What about the preventative measures that can be taken to ensure that somebody is alive, well, and healthy? And so rethinking that and looking at causality of illness and causality of disease and even causality of conflict is what one of the major sparks for me and my fellow teammates and family, why we wound up creating CAVI. CAVI itself is a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention and prevention program focusing on reframing this entire conversation we have around violence and trauma. Trauma itself is looked at, especially as an emergency physician, we look at it as injury that's the direct result of force. But trauma itself is much deeper than that. It's not just a physical process, it's a mental process with just as dire consequences. I had these ideas a long time ago, well before I became a physician. I always, my dad is an activist and learned from C.T. Vivian, who was his mentor, and Dr. King, whom he met when he was in high school. He always had this idea of making sure that the people in our community in which we serve is going to be at their best. My mom is a retired teacher, and she always used to think, how do I make sure that the students we have within our community are going to be performing at their best? And so these conversations I had as a kid and then later on as an adult, but just kind of bringing it to this overall space of healthcare. As an emergency physician, we're trained to see people at their worst. I was like, I need to know these procedures to keep people alive as an emergency physician, but it's probably even more powerful to start looking at ways to prevent these injuries from taking place to begin with. Violent trauma itself is the number one cause of death for Black men ages 15 to 34. Why does vitality have to be something that isn't expected? Why is it that if people aren't performing at their best state, coming from marginalized spaces, that is the norm? We want to make sure that people do perform at high levels. We want to make sure that people do have access to opportunities. But in order to really get to the nitty gritty, this goes beyond just gun violence. It's really, how do we maintain a level of equity and maintain levels of civil liberties within our specific communities? Those are the root causes of conflict. It's not just having access to a gun. It's not just having access to a knife. But it's really looking at a root cause analysis and looking at and really having this comprehensive understanding of causality and the conditions and situations that give rise to incidents of violence and conflict. So CAVI's programs are hospital, school, and community-based. Within our hospital program, our team helps coordinate intervention efforts with additional community-based organizations and the hospital for patients who are coming in as victims and survivors of violent injury. When someone comes in with a violent injury, there's close to 50% chance that that person is going to come back to the hospital with a repeat injury within a 5-year time frame, and 20% rate of being killed within 5 years after that initial injury. And things that our team understands and things that other organizations around the United States that do work within the violence intervention space understand is that when you are injured, you are vulnerable. When you are injured, you are scared. You may not think as clearly as you'd like to because you are in this acute stress state. And if you already have pre-existing stressors, pre-existing PTSD, pre-existing anxiety, pre-existing depression, pre-existing poverty, pre-existing unsupportive environments, this additional stressor is something that can further compromise your state of well-being. And so our team is there to help provide support, and support can come in the form of being someone that you can talk to after that incident has taken place. It can be support for your family. Before we were doing this work, when a young person came in with a violent injury, we provided life-altering procedures in the event it was warranted. They may go to the operating room. They may get stitched up. They may get a chest tube. But then afterwards, once that person was healed up physically enough to go home, we would say stay out of trouble and be safe, not thinking about the circumstances that can contribute to a person coming back. And so we're there to support. We're there as advocates. In some cases, it's as simple as helping somebody get an identification card, or helping them secure a safe place to live, or even just ensuring that that person has a safe way to get to and from their neighborhood to the hospital, which may be on the same street, just a mile and a half, 2 miles up. But if you're already put in a vulnerable situation because you're walking with a limp, that sets you up to be an additional target. So our team helps coordinate those efforts to ensure that safety is maintained, that a sense of well-being can be maintained, and so we can further optimize other elements of that person's treatment so they can be healthy once again. Our school program works a little bit differently. We work with young people who are considered to be at risk, which is pretty much any kid who lives in Central Brooklyn, which tends to have Central Brooklyn itself. For people who aren't familiar, we have the highest rates of interpersonal violence in Brooklyn. We have highest rates of new transmission of HIV. We have the highest rates of uncontrolled, untreated hypertension and diabetes, highest concentration of poverty. So there's all these different determinants which impact our overall health and well-being. And so we work with kids who are considered to be at risk. Some are, have histories of frequent fighting and underperformance within school. Some are high performing, but have had a lot to deal with in terms of conflict, whether it's in their community, whether it's in their personal life. They may have lost some friends due to violence, and we want to make sure that we are a support system to in addition to the school. We aren't there to replace school social workers. We're not there to replace teachers. But when a teacher and a principal and a social worker understands that there's an additional support system, that further strengthens that safety net. And so that's what we're there to provide. We do weekly workshops that focus on everything from mediation and conflict resolution to skill development, but even just doing regular check-ins. Think about how powerful it is when one of the person that you come to see, the first question that comes out there in your mouth, other than just a standard greeting, is, "How are you feeling? Are you good?" As free as judgment as possible. Think about how powerful that is. One of the key things as it relates to ensuring that people are calm and focused is understanding the trauma. Trauma can come in so many different forms, but having somebody that can acknowledge, yes, I understand, I hear you. I understand that you went through a traumatic experience, not even just in your neighborhood, but coming into the building, because you've already been stopped by the police on your way to school. You've already been stopped by school safety officers because you have to go through metal detectors in order to get into your school, on top of having to deal with your own personal tragedy that might have taken place. So there's a lot of deep-seated trauma that comes in that gets unchecked and just escalates because of all these different triggers. And so our team is there really being in an environment so that people can hear you and acknowledge that you've been heard, but saying, you know what, I hear you. I might not understand where you're coming from, but I am willing to learn and I'm willing to engage and I'm willing to cultivate this space that will allow you to express yourself. When you know that somebody's not grading you, which is also one of the reasons why we're there. If you know that your teacher's grading you, and you can get an assessment from them that can impact your scholastic success, you tend not to be as forthcoming with some of the issues that you're dealing with on a personal level because you don't want to be judged in that space. But having a group like CAVI that can be a little bit more neutral can be an additional support system to further get them the things that they actually need in order to be at their best. We are so focused on maintaining and survivability that we don't understand what it means to really thrive. Most of the work that I deal with outside of the emergency department, even in the ER, is looking at conflict. And you said something about you can't battle a kid one-on-one. And it was like in that opening chapter. And, it's something that really resonated. And it's something that I talk to with my residents in the ER. I'm like, look, if you already start seeing, look at the environment. What is the person saying? What's their energy looking like? Are they in a position to hear you? And sometimes people are so angry and upset that no matter what you say, you're going to, depending on how it gets articulated, yes, you might be correct, but you don't need to develop this adversarial relationships. Once you develop that adversarial relationship, you've lost that person. You no longer have that rapport. And it also causes the rest of the ER to get loud and rambunctious, which means now you have an entire place where people are sick and aren't at their best, and nobody wants to hear you because now you're looked at as this villain. So just kind of thinking about picking your battle. So there's so many gems just in those first few pages, and stuff that me and my colleagues and friends have been talking about in terms of how we educate, how we empower, how do we make sure that we stop looking at kids as being problematic and looking at, how do we extract what those natural talents are.
And I'm thinking about what it is that drew me to you, your presence, but also drew me to your work, your outreach work, beyond the hospital. And I think it's because you operate in the world with the spirit of a teacher. Like the idea of being able to identify that to the folks in your audience is like the fact that you see it is that you think in the world through this role of teacher, right? And I'm drawing corollaries between both of our experiences because in many ways, like, folks are coming to the hospital to see you because they're not physically well. Young folks are coming to us in the classroom and connecting because they're not emotionally well, right? They're not educationally well. And I think this idea of looking at wellness in a more robust way and recognizing that how you deal with unhealthy folks is similar across contexts. And we're equipped with different tools to help different forms of the absence of wellness. But at the end of the day, we're in the work of healing. And that a good teacher operates with a physician's mind to help heal, help make comfortable. And the best physician operates with a teacher's mind to create the conditions to allow a person to reveal what's in them so you can help them be better. You know what I mean?
100%. And my mother's a retired teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. My great-grandmother was a teacher. And so, there's a long lineage of Black women educators in my family that have always worked in the community. My mother, before she retired, and she was even working with our violence intervention program. We brought the OG out of retirement to work with us.
I love it.
Now she taught in pre-gentrified Fort Greene and in Bed-Stuy for over 25 years. And because of health reasons, stepped back, but still was actively engaged. And even just using her motorized scooter, she would tutor the kids within our program. I think, it's interesting. A lot of folks, we're looking at, we're trained to look at and investigate and evaluate problems and kind of troubleshoot. But when you're not looking at a system, you're looking at a person. And there's so many different elements of what constitutes an actual being that we have to look at the subjective, the objective, but also the feelings behind it and the emotions behind it in order to really access what that potential is. People say, your program, the program changes people. No, it doesn't change a person. It brings out what they already had in them. But, just thinking about what role environment, what role words, and how we as educators and as healthcare practitioners can really help cultivate spaces of well-being. And that's really what we set out to do when we created CAVI, to create these spaces that healing was going to be part of what the model was, not looking at. It's not a gun violence program, although a lot of people want to say, oh, this is a gun, you do gun violence intervention. I said, no, you say I do gun violence.
That's your interpretation. That's right.
That's your interpretation. But if you're just looking at it as gun violence, you've completely missed the boat. What are the circumstances that give rise to situations that prevent us from being and performing at our most optimal state? And I had this conversation with my mom yesterday. I always like to bring in the OG when I talk about education. And I never heard of, I think his name's Howard Gardner. And about, what was it, multiple theories, multiple intelligences. And I hadn't really thought about that. It really came to my attention. Now, everybody's thinking of, looking at the NBA finals within the bubble, and looking at LeBron, looking at Jimmy Butler, and seeing, these young men performing at these high pressure states and spaces. And Iman Schubert made a comment. He was talking about LeBron James. I think it might have been an old interview, and he said LeBron's basketball IQ is like out of this world. And I never heard somebody talk about a basketball IQ. But when you look at people, and then this is how I brought this up, and this is my mom taught me about the multiple theories of multiple intelligence. And you realize that it's a science. It's a science of performance. It's a science of understanding of your body awareness at specific times, spaces, and positions to perform in these high stress states. And he said, he would see things, like 5, 10, 15 steps ahead with an encyclopedic knowledge of his fellow competitors. But when many people start looking, they speak about athletes, and many of us, in order to get to college, we had to play sports to get scholarships, to get in forms of higher education. But there's been a downplay in athleticism, and a downplay in, I like to call it the age of the egghead, where people don't often think about what role sports can play, but also not looking at people who are athletic as being scientists within their own respect.
So that one right there, I think that you said so much, bro. You talking like I want to take notes. You know what I mean? Like it's so much. Like I think the idea of a basketball IQ, I think it relegates the depth of that knowledge to basketball, right? No, this is an intelligent human being who understands space and time. And just say, and I know he's saying it because that's his guy and they're playing ball, but this guy is more intelligent than you can imagine, and it gets manifested in the craft he engages in. And that skill set is applicable across contexts, unbeknownst to everybody else, because he's chosen this craft, right? And it just reminds me of that, that shut up and dribble thing that LeBron got critiqued for back in the days. It's like, it's easy for you. First of all, you can say someone should shut up and dribble, but you can't dribble.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So your experience and genius you couldn't do. But the genius they express on the court is actually more cerebral than physical. And I'm sure that he can be a news anchor if he chose to apply that genius to this craft. And I think looking at each other in more expansive and robust ways allows us to engage in the world differently. And even looking at our problems, which is like the dopeness about CAVI, right? It's like looking at our problems is not gun violence, but more robust. It's like, it's because I recognize, and maybe that's that medical lens, right? That holistic health gets manifested in different ways with different symptoms. So gun violence is a symptom of a more robust and complex issue. So if I address a more robust and complex issue, then it won't get manifested in gun violence. And part of the reason why, issues that affect folks of color persist is because we look at the outcomes and not the causes. Right. And we don't look at the causes because they're more systemic, and there'll be indictments on those who are looking at the outcomes. You know what I mean?
Well, think about it. If you're not looking at causality and cause of the cause, then people are able to maintain a certain way. And naturally, certain people in positions of power like to maintain a level of conformity. I'm just thinking about like the opening chapter of your book, and like I was just taking notes and stuff, and I think about like education assimilation and just this concept of conformity. Looking at everything. You were talking about the Carlisle School, the Carlisle Indian Reservation, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which is designed to educate the Indian. And you have these former U.S. military people and other people of their community, not the Native American community, who are going in and we're gonna educate these poor, downtrodden people so that they can have a better chance. No, you want them to have a better chance in the society that you were creating, not what was already there, and not understanding what unique elements they've already had in existence. It doesn't mean that you can't learn from somebody else coming from a different space, but why do you assume that because you have a different viewpoint that they're wrong? Now, I could see if you were dying as a result of something. I could see if you were in ill health because of particular decisions. But to downplay the natural instinct and abilities that a person already possesses, really, it's really creating this system. This allowing you to fit in someone else's society with you being the spectator, but not being expected to be an active participant in changing and engaging other people in it. This whole concept of conformity is pretty interesting. My wife is an amazing entrepreneur and from the beautiful country of Ethiopia. My father-in-law worked for the African Development Bank before he retired, and was helping set up banks throughout the continent. Because of that, her and her family had to move around. She went to boarding school in Kenya. She went to boarding school in the U.S., but the family also lived within Ethiopia and in Burundi. And so you come in contact with all these different people, but Kenya was a pretty much an eye-opening thing for her. Like, when I first met her, a number of years ago, she had like a slight twinge of a British accent. I was like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. And she'd be like, no, and she would fight hard to get back to her original accent when she was growing up in Ethiopia. And the reason is, she said, the nuns at her school that was right outside of Nairobi, they would say, this is not how you pronounce this. This is how it's supposed to be pronounced. And so you start taking on this accent of somebody who's somewhat of an enforcer and an oppressor, just so that you can conform to that place and space. And so, and even like, you and I, we grew up here and we have friends whose families grew up in other countries, and they didn't teach their kids their mother tongue because they didn't want the kid to get that accent. And it all kind of comes back to this whole concept of conformity. And you're conforming in a way, in a place that wasn't designed for you. And so you're expected to adhere to those rules which govern you, which tends to bring about certain elements of conflict because you're naturally resisting someone who is trying to oppress you and keep you put in place.
And beyond the conflict, brother, is also the stress that we oftentimes don't consider, right? Like the sort of like psychological labor of navigating spaces without freedom to engage in it, tapping into your natural genius, right? So now, rather than just engage and ask a question or respond, I'm now saying, should I say it this way? Am I enunciating properly? Do I have the proper accent? Do I have the proper norms? Am I being respectable enough? I think really about Kamala Harris yesterday in the vice presidential conversation, with the type of intellectual and emotional gymnastics that she has to go through just to be able to engage with this guy. Like, I don't want to be an angry Black woman. I have to be approachable. I have to be kind. I don't have to make this about me. But he's lying, and so I can't even be present enough to debate on the issues, right? Because I have to navigate whether or not I am being acceptable to those who are my audience. I think that exemplar occurs in the lives of young folks and even us all the time.
Right.
And I always say that I could tell. I think that everyone has genius. I can tell who hasn't been able to tap into their genius by their inability to operate with comfort. And I think that comfort or the lack thereof is the assessment of whether or not you're operating in your full genius. And whenever you're uncomfortable in who you are, no matter how great you are, you've not entered into the dimension of operating more wholly and in a more actualized fashion.
It's important to be given an opportunity to obsess about certain things. Not things that are going to be detrimental. You're not talking about obsessing over a broken relationship and something that's traumatizing, but obsessing about something that kind of brings you joy and happiness. Education, empowerment. It might be a sport, but to be given that power to fully engross yourself in a subject matter, in an area, in multiple areas, and start looking at how you start connecting the dots is a special privilege that isn't often appreciated. So, suppressed insight, suppressed knowledge, suppressed education, we're seeing the manifestations. So, you have a kid who's told that, he or she or they were outspoken and needed to be put in place because they're speaking up against something that really doesn't sit with them. And instead of having a dialogue about it, we're trying to maintain order. And so the concept of, maintaining order is a tool in itself, but you can obsess about certain topics, about certain subject matters that could really be transformative. But because somebody has to prove a point, and engaging in a way purely for nostalgia's sake, and maintaining a sense of face is something that's really creating a level of internal trauma that many people don't often think about.
If you obsess over what brings you joy, you operate with a certain level of wholeness. Yeah. And I would just add to that, obsess over what brings you joy in spite of whether or not it brings discomfort to folks who are around you, right? So now when I say discomfort, I'm not saying harm, because you don't obsess over something if it brings harm to someone else. But if it brings discomfort, like if your joy brings someone discomfort, you either don't need to be around that person, or you need to pursue your joy so strongly that you convince that person to join you in your endeavor. Right. And so to me, it's like, as long as it doesn't bring harm.
I mean, that's one of the first things we learn in medicine. The first thing you learn is do no harm. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of made me start thinking about elements of, like in Buddhism, they talk about the Four Noble Truths, but really the Eightfold Path, and, right speech, right livelihood, as two examples of that, but ensuring that what it is that you do doesn't bring about harm to another person. I like how you say it's okay to make someone uncomfortable, but discomfort and harming someone with intent is a very different thing.
Yes.
And which shows that there's been some malintent, which also shows that there have been some traumas and triggers that you feel like you have to hurt somebody, whether it's verbally or physically, in order to prove a point, as opposed to looking at how do we fix this issue and how do we bring about some healing. Now, in some instances, if somebody's enjoyed power for a very long period of time, and if we start talking about creating equitable environments as we move about healing urban and now suburban trauma,
yes.
If it causes a power shift and that person who was in that position of power for long periods of time can't take care of themselves or their well-being, it might be somewhat hurtful. But then again, some of those things are very subjective. We're not talking about people not being able to maintain a way of life to care for their families, but you shouldn't be able to do that and cause harm to another. It shouldn't be at the expense of someone else. And it's got me thinking, we're in the era of cancel culture.
Yes, sir.
And I'm so happy that there are so many mediums that are out there that people can articulate these points and express their feelings and emotions and concerns about what's going on in the world. But canceling without fixing is problematic in itself.
That part.
It's almost like out of sight, out of mind. If it's out of sight, out of mind, that means that shit just gets tucked away in the subconscious.
And it's allowed to fester. It's allowed to fester, and when it's allowed to fester, it becomes contagious. Because if you isolate someone and place them in a geographic space that's somewhere else around no one else who knows them, or other folks who've been sequestered, they just form this hyper evil thing. And I think and this I didn't want to necessarily go ahead, but cancel culture is not Afrocentric. Cancel culture is not the way of Black folks. We've historically existed with communality, with the idea of restitution, with the idea of sort of collective ownership of harms caused, and who else is at play that supported the endeavor, a recognition of that part, and an open revealing of truths, and an open conversation about the path forward. I think that we've adopted this cancel culture narrative that is not only harmful to those who are canceled, but it's harmful for those who are doing the canceling. Because in many ways, what it does is they end up replicating a power structure that they're trying to escape themselves. And right. So you have the oppressor's discourse embedded in your psyche, and you utilize that as a mechanism to be able to cancel out somebody who looks just like you, that you're canceling. And I think if we are more thoughtful about how we engage in the world and realize that canceling is not solution, but most importantly, canceling is the adoption of oppressive ontology, right? And it's the internalizing of practices that have done violence on you and your people historically, on other folks in the contemporary. We start revisiting our approach to healing. You can't say you're engaging in cancel culture and then say that you love Black and brown babies. Right. Because Black and brown babies will push back against norms and structures in schools that are oppressive, and because when they do something wrong, were you gonna cancel them too? And then instead you might as well look in the mirror and cancel yourself.
So I was thinking, like, during the protests, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, I have a friend, one of my jiu-jitsu training partners. This is a brother named Frank Tornetti. So I got to give a shout out to Frank. Frank is with NYPD, and he grew up in a mixed environment, mixed schooling, with folks of color, and we were talking about this whole concept of fear. And fearing the community in which you serve. And we were talking about, people who work in certain communities are often, and don't understand them, have never spent any time with them, are naturally fearful. So if you fear something, when Nas said, people fear what they don't understand, they hate what they can't conquer.
That's the theory of man.
It's just a theory of man.
Yeah.
It makes me think about Frank and I's conversation. He said, you have people who are coming from communities that are completely foreign to the environments that they're working in. They weren't brought up with them. They don't understand cultural expressions. They don't understand how people are living. And if you've been taught to fear that group, and naturally you're going to wind up being adversarial. Yeah. So I was thinking about that, but then just kind of taking it up another notch when about this concept of defunding the police. Yeah. I do think that the police departments around the United States need to be restructured and redone. But in this era of cancel culture, when you say defund police, and you or I, we're from here, and we have friends who are police officers. When you say defund the police, what they think of is you're taking away my ability to care for my family. Without saying restructure. I mean, I understand, we have to use certain words that kind of indicate power, but there's not that same conversation about how do you, if you don't need officers in this space, how does a police officer maintain their livelihood? How do they take care of their family? And this is the same thing that happens with ageism as it relates to, as we start having this shift in workforce. And my dad told me, my dad does television production, and he's always been an activist since he was in high school. And he said, me and my friends, all of us who are still doing TV and media, the only ones who are still employed are the ones who have their own companies. He said, back when, when I had just finished medical school, I already finished residency. He said, and he meet people and stuff. And he didn't like to tell folks that his kid was a physician, because that already puts you in this old person category, which means that if you're old in certain industries, you become obsolete. And so how do you make sure that all members of our community are in a position not to become obsolete? Because if that person becomes obsolete without any I shouldn't say this evolution to this next phase of how they can care for themselves and to care for their families. That's when people start engaging in certain types of illicit behaviors. That's when people start doing things because these are triggers. When you know that you have to go into a survival mode state, you don't make good decisions.
Facts.
Which is why we see a lot of people coming in with violent conflict and recurrent trauma over and over again that spark from an argument. Not even that you stepped on somebody's J's, but you looked at somebody's J's and I thought you might step on my feet. And even though you're 10 or 15 feet away, but because you were walking and weren't paying attention to where you were walking, I thought that you might, step into my personal space. And so these are little tiny triggers that bring about all these dumb conflicts, but without really thinking about what are the parties involved? And I learned this from a fellowship I did called PLS, the Presidential Leadership Scholars, and they were talking about what are the core values of the people that you're actually working with and dealing with. Especially, as when we're in this space of conflict resolution and mediation and working with people who've been injured. And our team members, I got to give a shout out to the CAVI team. I got to give a shout out to Man Up Incorporated, SOS. And GMAC, because these are individuals that we work very closely with. In East Flatbush Village, these are groups that we work and GDLU. These are groups that we work very closely with that have been doing conflict work and mediation out in the streets and in the community. But when you're mediating somebody, you're trying to figure out, all right, what are these what was the reason for this overall conflict? And then you're looking at how do we fix it? You've got to first establish what are the core values? What do both of these people find important? And if family and community well-being and making sure that their kids are well fed and they have a safe environment, if that's first and foremost, that's where you start to work from. And in the fellowship that I did, we were talking about like how do different political parties push policies that are embraced by like how does a Republican push a bill that a Democrat embraces, and how does a Democrat do the same thing? But like you've got your moderates and you've got your conservatives and your super liberals and your super ultra conservatives. But, at the end of the day, you don't want to have these major impediments that you impede flow and impede progress. And so what are the core values that need to be established that both parties can understand? And that's how you start moving towards solutions. I'm like you mentioned before, and I'm going to keep using that. I'm okay with you being uncomfortable. But I'm not okay with you causing harm. And so we've got to figure out what that looks like. And the same thing, with violence intervention, with working in the community. I'm okay that you have a disagreement. I'm okay that you don't agree and you may not like each other because of certain comments, but I'm not okay with you causing harm. I understand self-defense. I don't understand you being the aggressor. I mean, I do understand it, but it's not acceptable.
Yeah.
We've learned, and history teaches us from the Mesopotamian code of Hammurabi, from an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I read a paper by a physician named John Rich. So shout out to John Rich and the Healing Hurt People team out in Philly and the VIAP, Violence Intervention Advocacy Program folks over in Boston City Hospital. But John Rich, was a paper, and he was talking about, violence. And, he said, we talked about if someone, thinking about like conflict itself. And like if somebody attacks you physically or verbally, it's imperative that you respond aggressively, because if you don't respond aggressively, he used the term, he said, it's viewed as tolerating victimization. It sets you up for additional opportunities to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, that's a bar right there. Yeah.
So, no one wants to be taken advantage of, which is why we don't like bullies. You don't want to be in a position that you can't care for your family, because that means that your livelihood is compromised. And so what is essential for your survival and for your ability to thrive without the expense of someone else losing something? With those who are in positions of power and intent on maintaining those in positions of power, and those who aren't are fearful of those who are in power, usurping that. And so you create these conflicts that have been, constantly, ever present. And so how do you get that balance? How do you establish that equity? How do you figure out what are the resources that are needed? And this kind of takes it back into this concept of environmentalism and environmental advocacy. A lot of the conflicts that develop aren't just because we aren't civil in the way that we treat each other, but because we don't have the specific needs that are essential for our overall survivability. And so if you have something that is renewable and reusable, so I got to give a shout out, to Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. You've drilled that stuff into me as far as looking at the role of environmental sustainability. If you have something that's renewable and reusable, then you aren't going to be without. If you have something that has a finite supply, you will be without. And if it's something that you've gotten accustomed to utilizing because it's made you in a different position, and now you no longer have it, but this other group has it, now you've got that conflict that keeps happening, and keeps happening, and keeps happening. And so, looking at how the interplay with improving quality of education and making sure that people can experiment with new things that are going to bring about, that they can obsess over, that's going to bring about a sense of community change, well-being, and community synergy. Looking at how this connects to the utilization and environmental sustainability, as it has plays this overall role in shifting what we've become accustomed to with violent conflict. It has to be this embracing of what of how do we improve these social determinants which impact our overall health and well-being.
I think sometimes growing up in certain spaces and certain moments, I would argue that growing up in Selma, Alabama, in a very particular point in time, right? Growing up in California, at the Rodney King moment. I think growing up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, in the late 80s, where crack was hitting, if the big influx of immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, the confluence of the sort of Jewish presence, and hip hop's breeding ground, that moment. And this is not just me waxing poetic and nostalgic about a moment where I was born in, literally taking a historical perspective and looking at this moment. There's something about folks in that era and how they look at the world that is special, very special.
No, it's so funny you bring that up. So, I went to elementary school across the street from Kings County Hospital, which is where I work. I'm in Kings County in downstate. But we lived in Fort Greene at the time when I started going to school out here. Because at the time, PS 235 was the only full magnet school that was taking kids of color in the borough. So we came from all over the borough to come here. And then most of the folks from 235 wind up going to Philippa Schuyler or Meyer Levin. And, but growing up in Fort Greene, you didn't have as many immigrants. You had a Puerto Rican community within Fort Greene that, we grew up with. But outside of that, I didn't really see that until I wound up going out to East Flatbush, where you started seeing this influx of new Caribbean immigrants. The folks from Jamaica were already established, and they'd been here for maybe a generation or two. But then you had the Trinis, who had a little bit more money because they had oil and they had resources. Same thing with the Bajans. And then you had the Haitians who were coming in, who were very different. They might have the pointy shoes. They had the different names. Some had some money. Some didn't. Some were, families had fled because of, they were part of another regime, and others, had fled because of poverty and civil war. And it was an interesting thing to be this kid whose family is from the deep South, through Chicago and through Buffalo and through Virginia, and just kind of seeing this stuff. But it's like you're a part of it, but you're not a part of it because you live here and because you look like them and because you're kind of coming up together. What does that look like? And then where we moved to in Flatbush, now they call it Dippish Park. We were on the border of Flatbush and Midwood. And so you had the large Orthodox community that wasn't too far away, but then you had the large Caribbean community that was right there. Because we only lived a couple blocks from Newkirk Plaza. And then you also had the increasing Middle Eastern and Eastern European community just down the street, and kind of coming together in our apartment building. And so you start looking at this globalness and this global microcosm within within just one street. So you start looking at the world very differently. You start looking at this interconnectedness, but also what makes people tick.
Mm-hmm.
But it also, I think about like, traveling around the world has shifted. I shouldn't say shifted. It's enhanced my perspective. I've never really been fearful of traveling around the world. My mom grew up traveling. She did some of her undergrad in Kenya during the time of Jomo Kenyatta. My mom spent time in Mexico. My mom was African American. She grew up upstate New York, but had those opportunities. And then, so I used to hear those stories. And then growing up in Brooklyn, and then you got a father who's an activist, and so you start thinking, it's like, oh, and he's like fascinated with engaging with people. So traveling outside of the world, it's like, okay, this is supposed to be the norm. And you kind of see some of that, growing up in Flatbush. But for many people, and I didn't understand it until I moved outside of New York City for undergrad, and I moved to Atlanta. And you start seeing, you have this really interesting eclectic group of Black folks from around the world that I didn't necessarily see. Like, I didn't know rich Black people before. Like I never saw that. I never saw Black affluence, other than like, you might have an upper middle class person, but not somebody who's like, nah, my family is rich, like rich. And they've had money and resources for a while. But then you also looked across the street from the schools, and you had that sharp demarcation between the haves and the have-nots. And I was like, okay, this is what it means to really be polar. And then moving to Buffalo for medical school, looking at, I never been around like large groups of Irish immigrants and large groups of Italian immigrants. So like, we didn't go to Bay Ridge as kids. We didn't go to Bensonhurst, Yusef Hawkins, like we remember all that stuff. That's alive and well in our childhood. So we weren't allowed to go over there, but Flatbush and East Flatbush was a different kind of mixture. But thinking about what makes people tick and what it's like in a very polarized community that doesn't have this constant influx and this inflow and outflow of different people, you start to see how certain cultures start to grow and how things can be very insular, which has an impact on overall well-being. Going to school and spending time in a place where industry was the heart and soul of the community, and when that goes away, people's they're not able to maintain their livelihood, and so people start talking about bringing back factories and bring back fossil fuels, which
it's when they felt alive, is when they felt worthy, is when they had, right? You know what I dig about your perspective on things, man? You have this really strong ideology and perspective and philosophy, but you always make allowances for humanity. Like, you're always like, but I can see that. And I think that there's a unique skill set, bruh. And what I'm trying to do right now is like make sense of that, given what I'm learning about your story and your history. And I think it's starting to make sense now. Like, it's starting to make sense. People don't stumble into who they are, right? Who they are is constructed by the experiences. And this really wild, yet very Brooklyn, but very not. You know what I'm saying? Like, very Brooklyn, but very worldly. And I think going to Atlanta and Buffalo, understanding Atlanta and Buffalo, poverty, wealth, affluence, the heteroglossia of that era of Brooklyn, it helps to make sense of how you make those concessions on humanity. Is that an intentional thing, or are you just built like that's just a thing?
I think I'm built like that. So, Chicago, I also spent time in Chicago because my dad is from the west side of Chicago. I did my residency at Cook County Hospital. I enjoy connecting the dots. I think the beautiful parts of these journeys and the role of education and traveling the world, what that's allowed me to do is to start connecting those dots. When you are in this isolated place, it's like, this is what it is, because this is how things have always been. This is what we've always known. But thinking back to like literature, that I read back in the days from Things Fall Apart, where, you have this concept of hubrisness and excessive pride, then kind of taking that into like Antigone. And, you start speaking about, Creon speaking, talking about it's the tree that bends and sways that survives the storm. And it's not like you're trying to be liberal and appeal to everybody, but there's a power with understanding perspectives. And it doesn't, again, you don't excuse, but it does give you perspective. And I think as someone who is engaged in a helping profession, I have to understand all of the elements. You know, one medication is not going to fix a person who's sick. We've seen that, countless times, but it's the environment, it's the community, it's the level of support systems, it's the access to food, it's the access to an infrastructure, it's the access to economic empowerment and resources. And if I'm one-sided and I'm only seeing one thing, I can't connect those dots, which is essential for back to what my folks taught me, and that's to be at their best. Also, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a Jedi. Like real talk. Like one of the chapters that I'm writing is, I talk about Yoda. And so you start looking at this person who's short in stature and has all this power and has this ability to, it's not manipulate the environment, but to really cultivate what the environment is. And I was like, that's how I want to be. I want to use the force. I want to connect those dots in order to kind of bring, I don't know, maybe what they call talking about bringing about balance to the force. As a physician who is trying to evolve my level of advocacy and engagement with different sectors of the community, you've been an inspiration to me. So fun when the folks at Columbia, when they're like, is there anybody you think? I was like, Chris Emden.
That's love.
I was like, I don't know many people at Columbia that I can recall, but I was like, Chris is there, because I was like, I remember, and I've always wanted to do some stuff, and I've been talking about, and in these circles of higher education, there are not many of us, which is also why we fought so hard to increase equity and increase representation in these spaces. Like, I don't want to be the only one. I don't want it to be there's only a 1 or 2 degrees of separation with people who are working in these places. We want more people. We want them more diverse, but we also need that because of perspective. And for balance. And in order to do that, we gotta you start coming together in spaces like this, and planning for passing the torch. That's something that I've been talking to my dad about. Like, how do you pass the torch so that there are people who can continue? I don't want to say the work, but more so these movements. When we have come to pass. Expanding the terrain.
I always say that. Like, it's about expanding the landscape, you know what I mean? So that other folks can enter and other folks can contribute new things and new ideas. And you've always done that, King. Like, I appreciate you so much. And I appreciate that you wanted to engage in dialogue with me. I really want to do this again. Like,
let's do it.
Please do it again.